Hey, and welcome to the show today. You're listening to Zensensa.com, Feel Your Heart podcast. And we have another really great show for you today. This podcast is made by Zensensa.com, the leading relationship institute for relationship skills and courses based on science made practical. To get the 1 hour free webinar that will give you the key skills to get a safe, intimate, and passionate relationship, just go to Zensensa.com and sign up. The link is in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and leave a review. It really helps me keep the positive energy going to make more podcasts. Welcome to the podcast today. We got Mark Sharp on the show, and I look forward to talking to Mark about intimacy and relationships. Mark, I thought, would you be able to just give a little bit of background to the listeners out there about, what you're working with and what got you into that in the first place?
Sure. I'd be happy to, and thank you for inviting me to be on your podcast today. I've been looking forward to that. I'm a psychologist. I'm in the Chicago area in the United States, and I've been in private practice here for 14 years. I guess I started my practice in 2006. Before that, I'd worked in a community mental health center. So I've had a lot of experience actually. Before I started my private practice, I was running the child and adolescent treatment team at a community mental health center, and I've always had a real kind of focus when I work with children on working with families. And as I switched to private practice, it morphed over a few years until most of what I do now is working with couples and working with people around kind of more intimate, primary intimate relationships. Though I still do some work with families. And, you know, one of the things that couples have to deal with is figuring out how to parent together. So there's still a lot of that that's going on as well.
Yeah, thank you for
So,
telling us about
yeah,
that, Mark. And also, we'll get into a bit about the parenting later in the podcast. But I think I'm really happy that you mentioned that, because I think often when we try to do relationship therapy or counseling, whatever we call it, it's very focused just on the couple. And I like, that you bring in the idea of parenting, because really, as a family, it's a unit, and
right.
every piece of that unit also impact the adult relationship and their dynamics. So it's hard to just work with one without integrating the others. But where I really want to start with today is talking about part of the glue that holds relationships together, at least in
Right.
modern day, which obviously is intimacy and the emotional connection. Could you talk a bit about what that is, and why it's important to have in a relationship?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the word that you use there is the perfect one. It's the glue, right? It's the glue that actually keeps um, the structure of the relationship together is the emotional intimacy, and it's really about that sense of connection. I mean, you think about it, we are um, kind of wired for that. There's a whole idea about attachment and how that develops through childhood and whatnot. And we really look to be very connected and to someone else. And for most of us, that the primary place that takes place is in our primary intimate relationship, our spouse or partner. And for the most part, people want that, and it's something that they need. The person who really is very comfortable being alone is pretty rare in our society. So what is that? It really is about a sense of safety and a sense of shared emotional experience. A sense that we really have something in common that goes together. And it's interesting. I mean, this may be a little off topic, but one of the things that I find with a lot of couples is when they come in and start talking about intimacy, more often than not, they're talking about sex. Right? They say we have an intimacy problem. Usually, the first question I have is, "So, do you mean you have a sex problem?" And I'm not sure about that. What that comes from? I think some of it is because people are uncomfortable talking directly about sex, and so they use the word intimacy. And the reality is that a good sexual connection in a relationship really does enhance intimacy. And it's one of the tools that keeps people connected emotionally or can keep people connected emotionally. But intimacy itself is much than that. It's about um, person you look to when you need some emotional support. It's about feeling like you're not alone going forward into your life. So it's really about that. But it's hard. We don't have great words for it. And um, probably the key thing to creating that and sustaining that in a couple um, is being emotional to each other. That means being able to share emotional experience in a way that makes you feel vulnerable, but also that you have someone that you feel like is really sharing the positive experience with you.
Yeah, that's thank you for clarifying. And I guess that's also where often we have some issues in our cultures, because I think especially a lot of men, and we fall over on that category, haven't really learned
Yep.
the emotional language, right? Because we were very
Right.
stigmatized if we showed or expressed more softer emotions growing up. So we kind of inhibited that. And often with our friends, that's not the way boys they speak to each other, while women have much more practice, I guess, in that language. So
Right.
therefore it's often easier for them, and I hear often the complaint from a lot of women that they don't feel their man is emotionally available, or like you said, share, which makes it hard to then feel that intimacy, right? And then it becomes more functional. What are some ways maybe that, or I guess it applies both to men and women, that how we can build more of that intimacy, and maybe also specific, what can men do to try and, yeah, tap into those parts of themselves that maybe they have neglected for a long time.
Right. Well, I mean, I think a piece of it is you talked about it. There's this part of the culturation of men, in at least in our society, that emotion um, is associated with those soft things, right? With sadness and emotional pain and crying, and that manly men don't do that. You don't experience those things, or you're not impacted by those things. Um, and one thing I think is just to address that myth. There's um, this may go off, and it's probably not a great example because it's a woman doing it, but there's a story I tell sometimes, right? So let me back up a minute. So the statement of strength, when you talk about male socialization, is I'm not impacted by those soft emotions, and I don't express them. And the interesting thing is, lots of women sort of buy into that as well. There's the um, I don't if you seem to not be affected by things that hurt people or make people sad, that makes you strong emotionally. Um, and that's kind of a myth, I think. Most people have probably talked to someone about someone there's something they're sad about, or if you've ever gone to a funeral and someone starts to talk and then they start to cry and they say, I can't go on, because there's this myth that, if you're crying, there's something wrong. But the reality is, people can cry and talk at the same time, right? So there was a story here, and it still strikes me. It was probably 20, 25 years ago. And I've actually searched online to see if I can find video or something of it, and I can't anymore. But there was a young woman, girl, actually. She was, I think, 12 years old, and had gotten her private pilot's license. She couldn't fly by herself. I'm not sure how old you are, Thomas. You might remember this story, but it's probably a thing about how old I am. And she was trying to set a record to be the youngest person who had flown around the world. And she actually crashed and died. She had to fly with an instructor. And there was an interview on television with her mother. And the interviewer said to her, and this is the piece, said, "It must be very difficult for you to talk about your daughter." And she says, "No, it's not difficult at all. I love talking about my daughter. I was very, very proud of my daughter. I'm going to cry when I talk about my daughter, but it's not difficult for me to talk about her at all." And I'm like, that is a really different attitude towards emotion. It's like, emotion is there, and it just is, and you share it, and there's nothing you really have to avoid, or you have to try and say, I can't express this. I'm not sure. Am I getting too far off track here?
No, I think no, absolutely. I think it makes so much sense, and also that emotions just need to run their cycle, and I
Right.
guess the fact is we don't connect to each other through sharing how perfect we are. And like you said, the man
No.
who has it all together and I'm not impacted. The fact is, we feel connected when we do share these softer emotions, right? And we can see that
Right.
size when we can see the imperfections in each other, because that's where we feel human and we can all resonate with that. So actually, it can be quite disconnecting to be with somebody who constantly just you just see they have it all together. And I guess it's
Yeah.
just we learn, like you said, a part of socialization, that's how we have to come across, but it's just really
Right.
detrimental to the
It
intimacy, right, and connection.
doesn't. Yeah. It doesn't work well. I mean, yeah. Being sharing vulnerability is one of the best ways to create more connection and more intimacy. So you've probably also heard people say, well, I need to be strong for them, right? Talking about their spouse, or people really do this for their kids, right? And what they mean is, what they normally mean is, I need to show that I'm not affected by this horrible thing that's happened. So let's say in a family, grandparents have died. Well, the kids were really close to their grandparents. So I need to be strong for them. So I can't show them how much this impacts me. And that's a model of emotional support that many people have. And I kind of talk about it. The metaphor, the image that I use that I think is more useful is, that loss or that sadness, whatever it is, has a certain amount of weight. And when you share it with someone and you know that someone else is feeling the same thing that you are, it means that the two of you are sharing that weight. So it doesn't feel as heavy by itself anymore. And that's the kind of metaphor that I use to try and help people kind of open up in terms of sharing their sadness and sharing their vulnerability with each other.
Yeah, and I also, I think a lot of it has to do, we have this enormous fear of these emotions, because often we haven't learned to deal with them, and therefore they can feel
Right.
very overwhelming, like you said, whether it's sadness, fear, whatever it is. And I think it's such a big gift. I used to do social and emotional learning programs for kids, and there's no bigger gift than showing our kids how they can actually process their emotions, and how all emotions, if we just let them run their course, are okay. It's not that big a deal. Like you said, whether we need to cry, whether we need to get angry and punch the pillow, they're just emotions. And once we
Right.
do that, then the fear itself of these emotions go away, right? And I just think it's such a big gift to show our kids that, rather than to teach them to suppress it and push it down.
Absolutely. I mean, it is oftentimes the attempts to try and not experience or not express the emotion that creates more problems for people than it is the emotion
Yeah.
themselves. The emotions are pretty natural.
Yeah, that's right. So, so I want to get into also talking a bit about, the adult parts of a relationship. And you mentioned before
Yeah.
too, it's an important thing that people often come in and start saying, oh, it's an intimate thing, when it's really a sex issue. And you mentioned briefly that it's part of the glue. Could you talk a bit more about why sex is so important for a relationship, and why it's something that we should actually prioritize as well?
Well, because sex really creates an emotional connection between people, and it happens at a lot of levels. I think. I mean, there are hormonal changes that happen when you have an orgasm that kind of contribute to feeling connected, right? So, I mean, oxytocin gets excreted in our hormonal system when we have an orgasm, and that it's been called the cuddle hormone, I think that is, right? And so hormonally we get set up to feel closer to people when we have a sexual relationship with them, and it's just also I mean, it's a pleasurable experience. So sharing something pleasurable, well, hopefully it's a pleasurable experience. Sometimes things that happen within it to make it not a pleasurable experience are one of the barriers to good sex, but you want to make it kind of something that you share together, and so that creates more connection. And it is also a place where it's really easy to feel vulnerable. I mean, you're exposed. I believe that the French term for orgasm is le petit mort, right? Which is forgive my accent, but the little death, right? Because you're really vulnerable, both because you're usually naked, and it just feels like a vulnerable place. So it is also a place. It's this really positive thing where you're sharing vulnerability with someone, and there's all sorts of evidence out there that a good sexual connection in a relationship really helps with the emotional connection as well, and with that intimacy.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point because, as you mentioned in the beginning, it's part of the attachment bond sex because we release
Right.
oxytocin. And actually, I read a really interesting experiment, which I think I can't remember what animals it was, but basically they tried to induce more oxytocin, um, and basically, what they realized was that when they did that, then they started attaching and they became loyal to their partner. And what then happened when they started putting in something that blocked the oxytocin was the opposite, that they realized that they would start straying and they would go off and be with different partners. So actually, they also found that the level of oxytocin has something to do with whether we have monogamous behavior or not. So it was quite
Right.
interesting experiment.
That
Um,
makes sense to me. I'm not aware of that, but that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it is part of that attachment cue as well, the sex. And I think you mentioned as well that, sometimes sex is not good, sometimes it is. Could you talk a bit about what are some of those barriers that come up for people to have good sex in a relationship? Like, what are some of those blocks?
Well, so the biggest block that I run into for yeah, yeah, um, one of the big blocks that I run into with people is people just get anxious about sex, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, um, sex is one of those things that we get all kinds of crazy messages about as well, right? So there are a lot of kind of religious limitations on sex sometimes that people get beaten into them, like it's a horrible thing that you're not supposed to do until you get married, and then it's a wonderful thing, and it suddenly changes. And so sometimes people carry guilt because they've been made to hear that. There's also, I mean, on the opposite end of that, um, the way sex is portrayed in the media is that it is, it's always wonderful and glorious. And the reality is that when you develop a sexual relationship with someone, it isn't always wonderful and glorious when you start out. You kind of need to learn each other and what each other's response patterns are and how to do that. And so there's there's some skill that you can develop in being a better sexual partner. But it's one of those places where the myth is, well, you find the right person and then it just fits and it's wonderful. So there's all this kind of mythology about that. But then there's also what is sex, right? And people have this image of what it's supposed to look like. And so then they try to um, make sex happen for them or act it out in a way that fits with that image. And so and for many people that has to do with intercourse, and it has to happen in a particular way. And so I'll bet, to start that off, I'll say a sexual relationship for two people is going to work best if they just say it's about their mutual pleasure. Right now, there's a reproductive aspect of that. We can get to that in a little bit too. And actually, when that becomes too much of a focus, that can really mess with the sex life. But so let me give you something that I deal with a lot of couples is that they don't feel like they've had sex unless they've had intercourse. And then there's this command performance. It becomes about performing and doing the right thing. That can create anxiety. And in some cases, can create other problems as well. I was working with a couple a few years ago where um, the woman experienced intercourse as very painful for the most part. But she had this belief system that in order for them to actually have sex, they had to have intercourse. And so she was kind of demanding that her partner have intercourse with her, and he didn't want to do that because he knew that it hurt her, and they just had all sorts of trouble. If you could just relax and focus on the pleasure piece of it, there's a lot that can go into sex that doesn't involve intercourse. There's all sorts of other ways to stimulate each other and so on. So, um, that's one of the things. There's another thing that I see people doing, and it's that they kind of set sex apart as this very separate thing that's got its own place, and there's not any they don't they don't allow for sensuality outside of the boundaries of what they call sex, right? And so they're in that case they kind of sometimes have to turn on the sensuality, the connection, the attraction to each other in a physical way whenever they get ready for sex, and moving in and out of that room isn't always an easy thing to do. There's a guy, speaking of books, let me see. Oh man, I'm blocking on his name. I'll try and remember. But was a sex therapist. Wrote a book called Love Worth Making, and he talks about this concept that he calls simmering. Right, which is you can think about sex. You can do things that indicate your attraction for each other and that are erotic outside of the time when you're actually going to have sex. So have a passionate kiss when you say goodbye in the morning, even though that might turn you on a little bit, and there's not going to be anything you can do about that at the moment. That's fine. That keeps the kind of the juices flowing, and so that's one of the things I've really taken that idea of simmering on as well. Um, Maybe I've said enough for a moment. I'll pause and make
Yeah,
sure I'm
but
making sense.
you are, and I like what you said with simmering, because I think there's often this idea, especially for men, that sex begin when they're turned on, when they're in the bedroom,
Right,
and like you said, it's so important to realize that sexual response, and more so for women than for men, but for all of us to some extent, have also to do with the context that we're in, right? How stressful was that day? And
absolutely.
like you said, has that energy been built up before? And
Right,
therefore, I think you're so right, and it's about understanding that there's this whole spectrum also of building up anticipation to what's going to happen, which really enhance the response rather than just presuming, because we often as men have spontaneous desire, that suddenly we feel desire that they have the same that they don't necessarily have. So it's a good point you
right.
bring in. And I also like what you said about focus on sensation. You mentioned that in the beginning, because we are so
Yeah,
focused in our culture on orgasm that often it puts so much pressure. And I know a lot of women who mention to me and say, oh, I feel so much pressure, and that in
right,
itself become a block, right? Because now they start being concerned and anxious about it, and
right.
instead of just focusing, like you said, on mutual pleasure and making that the focus, that the exploration. Yeah, and again, I think then it can also become more playful without the stress of worrying about whether you're going to get to this goal.
Playful is a really good word to apply to it. I mean, because when you're playful together, I mean, what's play really about? It's about doing things kind of together without a whole lot of structure to create mutual joy. And I mean, what's wrong with that? Um, and sometimes sex becomes very serious for people. Like, so I made allusion to the reproductive part of sex, right? And I have known more than one couple where their attempt to have a child and having problems with conception has totally destroyed their sex life, because all of a sudden it becomes very utilitarian. Hey, it's the right time. We got to have sex, and then it's also usually starts to be associated with those feelings of um, we're failing at this thing that we really want to do, and that can be a very hard thing on a sex life. And for those couples, sometimes it's useful to maybe take it out of the intercourse sex piece, but to create some kind of a sensual way to physically connect with each other to kind of keep that going.
Mhm. Yeah, would you also be able to talk a bit about this idea that sex has to be spontaneous? Again, I think that's very much an idea we have in our culture, isn't it? That it should
Yes.
just happen. And again, it's obviously not true, but it would be interesting to just hear your opinion on that.
Well, this that is true. Yeah, a lot of people say, um, you know, yeah, good sex is spontaneous. But the reality is, if you're talking about a family, you're talking about people who get busy, and it is very difficult for sex to be spontaneous. And so planning, planning sex, making a sex date, if you want to say it that way, can also kind of contribute to that whole simmering thing, right? The anticipation of it can help with the arousal. Hey, I'm looking forward to our date tonight. Um, and to know that it's coming, think about it, share with each other things like that can start to build some of the um, can start to simmer some of that sexual energy outside of that. Now, here's what's interesting. I mean, if you think about the spontaneous, if you think about the spontaneous idea, right? Well, that's how people say that they learned about sex. That when they started becoming sexual, sex was spontaneous and in their younger years, and when you think about how where most people were when they became sexually active for the first time, um, they're usually in they're dating someone or they're doing something where they're going to get together and they're going to have sex. And they say it's spontaneous, but the reality is they have the expectation that whenever they get together, they're going to have sex. That's not spontaneous. There's a lot of anticipation going on there. There's a lot of simmering going on before they come together. That's kind of the way things oftentimes happen early on in relationships, right? There's a lot of sex. We really are hot other. We're going to get together when we see each other. It's not spontaneous. It's spontaneous that you don't plan to talk about it, but oftentimes both people have that expectation coming together. So I think the whole idea of putting some structure around it can really be used in a way to intensify the experience rather than um, take away from it. Now, if you plan sex and it sort of becomes drudgery and more like um, oh yeah, it's Saturday. I guess we should have sex again. Well, that's a different thing. That's maybe you need to start doing some things to enhance that connection, enhance that excitement more, so that you're more looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I also think one thing, because I think first you had a lot of good points here. So in the beginning of a relationship, the truth is we think it's spontaneous, but actually we do plan because we
Right,
make dedicated time to meet up and go on a date, and
right,
that's planning, right? It's saying we are meeting this day at this time at this place. It's not just all
yeah,
spontaneous, and often we forget that when we then live
and then
together and
and
have kids
oh,
and
right, and oh, by the way, when we have that date, we're probably both going to make sure that there's space in there to spontaneously have sex somehow.
That's right, exactly. So the fact is there is planning, and we think about what's going to happen. Like you said, there's that anticipation, and to try and recreate that as well. So yeah, I think there's some really good points, and also I think it's possible if it feels like an obligation, sex, then it's also possible to just say, these times in the week we set time aside where we basically are physical. It doesn't have to end up in sex. It could just be somehow
Right,
physical, whatever feels good, and that kind of, I guess, take away the pressure, and it also leaves up this uncertainty whether there will be sex or not. So it doesn't have that boredom of being predictable.
right.
Um,
It, yeah, that's. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
no, go ahead, Mark. That's it.
Well, the other thing that because you bring up another idea that I think is important is that sometimes when couples feel like anytime they start to get physically connected or affectionate or whatnot, that it's going to lead to sex, that actually shuts down affection, right? If there's some tension, particularly if there's tension between a couple over what the appropriate frequency is, one person has a much higher level of desire than the other person does. And that happens a lot. That's normal. And then it's kind of like, well, whenever I kiss her, the myth is that it's always the man who wants more sex. And that's true a lot of the times, but I've known a lot of couples where the exact opposite is the true too. Whenever I kiss her, she pulls away. Well, sometimes she pulls away because she assumes that whenever you kiss her, you're initiating sex. And affection in general, touching each other, kissing, just being affectionate really works to help create that emotional connection, to help a relationship feel better. And when all of that is the case, that helps to enhance the sexual aspect too, which then makes it safe. So finding space in a relationship to be physically connected, physically intimate, even without, if you can talk about it that way, physically intimate without it requiring sex is a really good thing for couples to do as well.
Mm, that's right. Yeah, I think that that's a really good one, and often, especially if people got into a toxic pattern where they find it difficult around that. So I want to jump to a different parts of
Okay.
relationship because yeah, then we get to the stage where some couples end up having kids and we become parents and that
Many
obviously
do, don't they?
and that obviously has an impact on the sex life. And
Right.
I guess it also brings up different conflicts. And one of the things I want to talk about, what do parents do when they suddenly realize that maybe they parent quite differently, and that obviously can bring up some conflicts that will then start having a negative impact on the relationship. What are good ways that they could try and handle these differences?
Well, that is, it's a big deal. I think of parenting and parenting differences. I've got my sort of big five of conflict in relationships, right? And that's one of them. Um, and first of all, they have to be willing to talk to each other. And I think if I had one piece of advice, what I would say is that they ought to relax. So the interesting thing is we have a very child focused culture in some ways, and there's all sorts of information out there about it and how parenting is so important and all of that. And I'm not disagreeing with that. But I think what often happens with that is then people get really invested in figuring out how to do it right and what is the right way. And so, whatever resonates for them, they start to feel very, very attached to. This is the right way. This is the way it does. This book, this article, this website, whatever says it. Now, they both may have alternating backup that, backs up their way of thinking. And I can really say to most of couples that I work with who are having problems around this that they would do better if they flipped a coin and chose one person's way of doing it and agreed on it, and it didn't matter what won the coin flip, then they are having the conflict about it, because the conflict between them about what they do as a couple usually creates more problems between them, which then also impacts the parenting and the effectiveness of the parenting more than whether they're doing it, quote, right or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And also, and I know this probably is not really helpful for people that already have kids, but I also think that if people haven't had kids yet, it's really important to sit and talk about these things before. It comes a bit back to when
Yep.
we talk about spontaneous sex. We kind of think that things will just naturally figure themselves out if we are a
Oh
good
yeah.
fit, which is not how it works. And just because we get on as two adults doesn't mean at all that we will parent in the same way. People just again
Oh,
presume we'll figure it out. So it's really good to sit down and have these discussions before there's any kids in play, and where you can really talk about, how are you raised and how do you see that as how you want to raise your kids, and kind
right.
of find at least some common values, right? Because I guess there are some
Right.
some things that are deal breakers and some that are not, where like you said, we can just, it's better to just choose, actually, let's just do it your way. And then there's other things that might be deal breakers, like, maybe you don't want you or your partner to ever hit your kids, right? So it's
Right.
important to just talk about these things beforehand.
Yeah, it is. So, and there's two. I absolutely agree with you. It's something that couples really should do. It's part of the. That's one of the conversations that couples really ought to have when they're figuring out whether they want to be life partners with each other. And I think there's um, you mentioned a couple things there, right? You want to talk about what your expectations are, but it's also really good to have that conversation about how were you raised and what were the expectations in your family, because um, what tends to happen with people is, they have all these ideas about how they're going to parent, but then when they have children, a lot of times, the kind of automatic learning about, well, this is how we did things in my family tends to kick in. And so it's useful to talk about both of those things when you're planning. Now, The relaxed piece, I said, I mean, clearly there are some parenting things that work better than others, and there's evidence out there that some things are not particularly effective, like physical discipline and hitting has consequences that other kinds of discipline don't. Okay, but it's not usually around big things like that. It's usually more about um, how are we going to implement this? What should the consequences be? Um, and um, what I really encourage couples to do is to try and come up with some compromise between what they're both looking for, and um, but that both of them can be comfortable with, right? It's probably not going to be perfect for them, but that they can be comfortable with. And then if they can lean into that and agree on that, um, they will often grow more into comfort with it over time. And I think of the other thing is there's kind of different levels to think about, right? And when I talk about parents and coming up with to couples and parenting about coming up with agreements without a parent, the first level you start with is, do you agree on what your expectations are for your kids? And then, do you agree? The next level is, do you agree um, how you are going to set up structure around that? So, what are you going to intervene in and what are you not? And then the next level is, how are you going to intervene? So, what are the consequences going to be? How are you going to put that in? How are you going to act and respond to things? And a lot of parents agree a lot on the first, and they have a lot more difference on the second two things.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up that point as well. And I think one of the challenges that I guess happens in pretty much every relationship where people end up having kids is how to divide the time. How do we find time and focus both for us and an adult couple and us as a kids? And very often, I guess, I read that I think a majority of divorces happen in the first 2 years after a couple have kids. And of course, it's because that time and focus is taken away from the couple. What is a way to,
Right.
to find that balance? Because again, having a stable adult relationship is also hugely beneficial to the children, right? Because it means we have more to give them, etc.
Right. Yeah, actually, say to people, one of the best gifts you can give to your children is creating a connection and a great relationship with each other, both because it's going to contribute to the emotional tone of your home and because you are modeling for them something that you ultimately hope that they're going to do as well. So um, it is difficult. Let's just be honest about that, what you're asking. And it is particularly difficult when kids are younger because they demand more time, more attention, and often contribute to that thing that parents love called sleep deprivation, right? But I think it is the most important thing is to keep the attitude of we need to make our relationship, we need to make our connection a priority. Because oftentimes what happens is um, that suddenly our relationship, our connection to each other drops to the bottom of the priority list. Everything else becomes more important. Kids rise to the number one. Then you've got to do the stuff you got to do to survive. And so, you know what? Yeah, we're good. We're just going to survive. But relationships need nurturing and continuity to continue on. And so making that a priority and consciously doing it. And I mean, the reality is if you make that a priority and even if you just talk about that every week, how are we doing with this? And it's like, we're not doing very well with this because we don't have time because um, the kids waking up every 30 minutes overnight, and so we're sleeping and we're too tired to have sex or cook dinner together or anything, right? But the fact that you've had the conversation even and said, this is valuable, paying attention to it makes a difference. And it will lead you to um, putting stuff back in there that allows you to be connected and focus on your connection to each other um, when that becomes available. And so, people make a big deal about a date night. It is good to have a date night where couples can focus on each other on a frequent basis and get away from all of the kind of logistical stuff they do. And I'll oftentimes tell them that, yeah, and on your date, you need to not talk about work and not talk about your kids. And some couples go, well, what are we going to talk about? And that's like, there you go. Find some other interesting stuff in the world to talk about because that stuff is important, but you're going to talk about those things anyway. So, um, and I hate to bring it up again, but um, in the last 4 months, when so many people have been under quarantine and haven't really had this option, this has been a really big challenge for a lot of couples. Um, those that even have done a good job of kind of making space by getting out of the house and um, having a date night and so on, are finding that's very difficult under the COVID-19 quarantine and all of that, and it's been a challenge for couples. I mean, some of them are kind of relegated to, let's just kind of close the door and make sure we have a conversation every evening that's just focused on us.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I think, Mark, I think so many good points you're bringing up there. And I think the fact is, you're right. Part of it is accepting that we simply don't have as much time anymore. But
Right,
I also think what I often say to people is it's about focusing on quality over quantity, because of course there's
right.
less, but the fact is, it doesn't take that long to build the connection every day, but it does take awareness of what you do, because often people come home and when we're tired, we want to just regulate our nervous system by watching TV or going on the
Right.
phone to numb out. The problem is that, that's not connecting. But even if it just is taking 2 or 3 or 5 minutes, that's it, 5 minutes
Mhm.
every day to sit down, look each other in the eyes, make sure you're not interrupted. And just you can either have where you touch each other, where you share something, whatever it might
Mhm.
be you want to do, but just that little time of dedicated attention is often enough. And it doesn't have to be, for hours and hours, but often I guess we just forget because we are not aware of the impact of not doing this. And it
Right.
starts taking its toll, when suddenly a year down the line, both people say, "Oh, I don't really feel connected to you anymore," and they don't realize what happened. And it's because these small moments where we did have time, we didn't give each other that quality of attention. And I just find that is super important.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it doesn't take much, but it's the quality of attention and it's the focus of attention on each other. Sometimes, one of the suggestions I will make to couples is just share two things that happen to you during the course of the day. And if you don't have both of these happen to you, at least share the one. Share something that had a positive emotional impact on you and share something that had a negative emotional impact on you. Because what you're really doing is you're sharing, here's what my emotional experience has been like. And that's a piece of what the emotional connection is, right? It's what you often hear is, I don't feel connected to you. I don't feel like I know you anymore. I don't know what your life is about. Well, that's because you don't really know what your partner's experiencing from day to day and from moment to moment. And um, and even when um, couples may have time, one of the resistant pieces I ran, well, they don't want to talk about my work because my work's boring and they don't understand it. And you're right. And my response to that is absolutely, they don't want to hear about the details of your work. However, they do want to hear the details about how your work is impacting you.
Mm.
Right. So you don't need to give them the details of the contract that you've been working on all day, but you can say, wow, I worked on this contract all day that was just overwhelming and it felt um, like I was going to be buried by it. Right? That's an emotional sharing. Or I was thrilled when it was done. That's the piece that's really important. It comes back to what we were talking about right at the beginning. It's the emotional connection, and
Yeah, I like
that's
that. I like
that's
that.
what can make it happen.
Yeah, so share the emotional impact that things had on us rather than the logistical details of everything
Right.
they have. That's a really good practical tip for people to implement. I like that. And I also think I want to talk to you a little bit about conflicts in relationship too, because of course it's inevitable. And I think a lot of people have this idea that it's about, getting rid of conflict. We want to get rid of the conflict, but yeah, how do you look at that, for conflicts in relationships? Is it a bad thing or not? Because again, it's a natural thing that there will be conflicts, right, at some point.
Yeah. If it's a bad thing, we're all in trouble because it's inevitable, right? I mean, you're going to have differences. You're going to have, and so what I like to work with people on is the most important thing about conflict is to find ways to have that conflict, find ways to disagree with each other, find ways to fight that doesn't damage your connection to each other, or that has or because often you can't always do that, to have mechanisms for reconnecting once that's been damaged, right? And so um, a piece of that is the place where I think most people feel the most vulnerable, and conflict is most likely to go off the rails is when they don't feel cared about by the or don't feel respected, or then that translates into feeling attacked sometimes, right? So it's important to do you're going to have disagreements, right? You're going to probably fight, you're going to hurt each other's feelings sometimes, but to keep at the base of it a sense that we are emotionally connected. um, if you both feel, okay, I care about you and I know you care about me, and I have your best interest at heart and my best interest at heart, and I know you have my best interest at heart and your best interest at heart. If you really believe those things going into a conflict, you can probably fight about just about anything.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point you just bring up now, because I think if there's a fundamental trust, like you said, that the other
Hmm.
want the best for you and that actually they are responsive to your needs, if that's an underlying pattern in a relationship, then a conflict is not necessarily going to have a big impact. And again, if you have repair tools, it can
Right,
normally easily be repaired. But if there's this underlying feeling that you can't trust your partner, or actually they don't want the best for you and they're not responsive to you if you need them, then it can become really destructive really quickly, right? And I
right,
think this is also why it is so important that day to day we try and be emotional responsive to a partner. It doesn't mean we can give them everything, but we can
right.
still be responsive, right? We can acknowledge their experience, etc., so they know we care. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I wanted to ask you as well. So, we get into these conflicts that's inevitable. What are ways that people can kind of navigate this so they have, I guess we can call it healthy conflict or constructive conflict instead of something that become destructive for them?
Right. So actually, as you were talking, I mean, there was another piece that I thought of about it, and that is that baseline of connection needs to be strong enough that it can tolerate being upset with each other. Because in my experience, one of the things that drives couples conflict and escalates it is um, what I might characterize as desperate repair attempts. Right? It One of the best things people can do to make sure that their conflict remains healthy is to have enough security and stability and belief and trust in each other that they can tolerate their partner being upset with them. Because what tends to happen is if you and I are in a fight and I can't, or we have a disagreement and I can't tolerate you being upset with me, I tend to escalate to try to get you to not be upset with me, and that usually comes with me telling you why you're wrong about being upset in the first place, which always makes things worse.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's at an emotional level, that's real basic. Now, if I'm sure you're familiar with John Gottman. So if you want some concrete things to do, the four horsemen of the apocalypse are a really good way to do. Those are four things that are always damaging in conversation and conflict, which is criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, or just sort of shutting down, and contempt, which is really, I mean, when you start to get sarcastic and cutting someone and name calling and so on, that's really damaging. So staying in control of keeping those things out of your conflict is helpful. The other something that's helpful with that, which it's an interesting thing I've come up with for couples, um, is that you should not be having conversations when your emotional arousal level is too high. When your sympathetic nervous system gets kicked into gear, um, you're really not capable um, of having those kinds of fights. Um, Actually, when your sympathetic nervous system is it's called the flight or flight system for a good reason, right? Because when it kicks in, it's basically preparing your body to face a physical challenge. So it pumps energy to the muscles and lungs and stuff like that. But it also shuts down blood flow to the parts of the body that are not seen as important to physical things, such as digestion. But the other piece that's not considered, apparently, is not considered important to physical response by our bodies is the frontal lobes of the brain. When our sympathetic nervous system gets aroused, actually we get less blood flowing to the part of our brain that makes us think. So we get stupid, basically. And so it is useful when you get really charged up to take a break. And I've created what I call it's a rule that I think every couple should have, and there's two parts of it. And the first part of it is anybody should be able to end a conversation whenever they want to. And usually, when I'm working with a couple and I say that, one partner goes, "Yes, that's absolutely correct." And the second part is if you end the conversation, it's your responsibility to bring it back up again. And the other partner goes, "Yes, that's absolutely correct." But the idea of that being that um, if I know that I'm too upset to have a conversation where I'm going to feel in control of my words, I should say, I need a break. But if I say I need a break, that means that I should be the one that carries the responsibility for carrying on whatever the conversation was. Because so often what happens is we have in couples, there's one person who is more responsible for making the conversations happen, and another person who is the one who um, tends to get more aroused easily. And so there's this start, arouse, shut down, start, arouse, shut down, or then both of them explode. So it's helpful. And the reality is it's much easier to tolerate partners saying, I can't talk about this if you know they're going to um, bring it up again. And it's also much more easy to tolerate your partner bringing something up with you if you know that they're going to be respectful of your own emotional arousal.
Yeah, that I really like those part, Mark. And I just want to also say, because for me, what has been really helpful is as you talk about the adrenaline response and our nervous system and fight and flight, is to teach ourselves some strategies that
Yep.
can help us self-soothe. So I know what I do if I'm in a discussion and I can feel my nervous system, I can feel I'm starting to get to a place where I know I'm gonna snap. Then I have different strategies. It could be even taking a pillow from the sofa and I squeeze it together to kind of release some of
Mhm.
that energy and slowly relaxes again. And it works. I know it sounds funny, but it works because it discharges some of that adrenaline, right? The some of my
Right.
fight response, and it means then my nervous system soothes and calms down a bit. So it's also important, I think, to have some tools ourselves of how we can regulate our nervous system when we feel we start
Absolutely.
getting into that danger window.
And a lot of the stuff is like that we say, well, it feels silly. I mean, it does really work because there's a pretty powerful connection between our physical body and our nervous system, right? And so there are things that we can do physically that help bring the nervous system back down under control. That kind of releases what you're talking about, releases some of the adrenaline and whatnot that's come up. There's an automatic relaxation response that happens with breathing out. When you attach visualization to that, that helps it. So breath is another really powerful thing. So yes, there's all sorts of things you can learn to do that. And it's also important to realize that people's nervous systems are different. Some people naturally soothe pretty quickly. Some people take a lot longer with that. And so it's important to understand both and your partners, or at least be respectful of your partner's
Yeah,
particular pattern.
thank you. I think that's important. You're right. We're different, and we need to respect that people have different responses and need different time. But I think there's been a lot of valuable content today, Mark, and I really enjoyed having this conversation with you. I think if listeners are sitting out there and want to work with you and know more, could you just tell them how they can find you online?
Yeah, my practice is the IQ Relationship Institute. That's AIKI. I've got my website is IQ Relationships with a dash, so it's AIKI-relationships.com.
Perfect. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Yeah, you've been a star, and I think some really good tips has been given out today. So thank you from me and also the listeners.
Well, thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
I hope you enjoyed the show today. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and come back for our new weekly podcast. Also, leave a review to keep the positive energy going. That really keeps me motivated to make more of these podcasts. If you want to learn the key skills to a safe, intimate, and passionate relationship, then head over to Zensensa.com and join the free 1-hour webinar. The link is in the description. You'll learn the 4 reasons that relationships break down, how your attachment style may fuel conflict with your partner, and how to break that cycle, why people cheat and the 1 tip that can prevent it, the simple 3-step formula to lasting love. So thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you next week for another podcast.